Well, thanks everyone for being here and your patience in waiting for us to begin. So we're about to begin now. I'll do the introduction. The title is called of the discussion today is called From Plantation to Forest. I think in my sort of assessment of plantations, and I used to be very interested and still am in plantations, that much is known of the 15th to 19th century plantations, slave and indentured labor, I should say, driven plantations, especially those plantations that were mainly cited in the Americas with their monocrops of sugar, coffee, and cotton and tobacco. Most analysts, at least when they invoke the term plantations, have these in mind when they speak glibly about the plantation, as if they're all the same. And despite the warnings of historical anthropologist Michel Rodriguez and the historical sociologist Danielle Purifoy about the care that should attend such generalizations. If in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Americas were sites of the plantation zones, then the 20th century may be said to be the time of Asian plantations, or in the time of Asian plantation zones. Yet while plantation capital has morphed into a relation requiring new forms of labor, wage labor, for instance, as opposed to enslaved or the more classical forms of indentured labor facilitated by colonial sovereignty, the plantation as a particular extractivist form remains. In fact, as our presentation today suggests, that particular configuration of commodity extraction has endured. Though the commodity has changed, the relationships embedded in that form of capital continues under different dispensations, buttressed by distressed states. This afternoon, Professor Danielle Purifoy will elaborate on the operationalization of these new plantation enterprises in a presentation entitled Plantations Are Not Forests. Professor Purifoy is Assistant Professor of Geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and holds a J.D. from Harvard and a Ph.D. from no less a place than Duke University. She will address the impact of these new plantations and which Black families have been incorporated or excluded, and their responses in to this new plantation species. Professor Purifoy's research focuses on racial politics and law and development in Black town and communities. Her essays have been published in a number of journals, including Society and Space, Environmental Sociology, Southeastern Geographer, among others. Please join me in welcoming Professor Danielle Purifoy.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. The talk I'm going to deliver today is actually excerpted in parts from one of the readings that I gave you for today, which is the article that I wrote for Environment and Society. But I'm going to focus more intensively on the biomass industry, which was not the central focus of that paper. But we will be covering very similar and overlapping terrain. So thank you for being here. The stretch of Highway 80 between Montgomery and Selma is a lush landscape almost unbroken by trees. The discernible crops, like the cotton for which the Alabama Black Belt region is infamously known, serve as a decoy of sorts for the crop that takes up the most literal space in the state, timber. Approximately 70% of the land area, or 23 million acres, of Alabama is timberland, 94% of which is owned by non-industrial private forest landholders, who are defined as any individual, group, association, corporation, Indian tribe, or other private legal entity that has definitive decision-making authority over the land. 62% of these lands in Alabama are absentee owned or possessed by landowners who do not reside on or near the land. The visual deceptiveness of the timber industry's presence is achieved by the strong resemblance of tree plantations to forests. Forests are complex, self-sustaining, biodiverse ecosystems which, in addition to providing sustenance to a variety of life forms, also provide necessary climate regulation and natural barriers against weather events like hurricanes, flooding, and fires. By contrast, tree plantations are monocrop landscapes that are difficult to support without chemical inputs, such as pesticides and fertilizers. The trees are planted in rows, and plantations provide very little biodiversity and viable habitat and sustenance for forest wildlife. Tree plantations are a current iteration of several modes of capitalist relations to Alabama's indigenous forest landscape, much of which was initially cleared in the 19th century for the cotton economy, disrupting lifeways and foodways of thousands of plants and animals and people. For many Black people living in the Black Belt, the site of their ancestors' enslavement, mainly on cotton plantations, the contemporary timber economy signals a different iteration of plantation power. Instead of the planter class controlling land and labor in place, most of the owners of the timberland and the Black Belt and the larger state live outside of the region and the state and employ relatively few people on a consistent basis. The impact of such remote control plantation power persists in its constraints over Black communities' choices for the future of the places where they have long built safety, solidarity, and power. Nevertheless, the freedom praxis of Black communities cultivated for generations preserve the memory of these ecosystems and the relations that are integral to the ultimate physical survival of the region, particularly as industrial extractions precipitate compounding social and ecological consequences. Black forest land owners operating within this landscape face tensions between their own desires to sustain the ownership of their family land and the benefits of its resources, and the economic and political constraints of the larger region that have been placed in large part by forest land owners who do not live on the land. Okay. So although I'm not a forest scientist, I've spent nearly the past 2 decades studying environmental racism and advocating for various forms of environmental justice, mostly in Black communities in the US South. In North Carolina, I first became aware of the fast-growing wood pellet industry at a meeting of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network in the early 2010s. A historic Black community in Northampton County in North Carolina, pictured here and here, was targeted for the second biomass manufacturing plant in North Carolina. This was probably around 2013, 2014. Although Enviva, the biomass corporation, is headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland, its primary business is to manufacture wood pellets for export to the UK and the European Union. These nations collectively use biomass as a strategy to meet their carbon reduction goals, ostensibly as a more viable and direct substitute for coal. This strategy also enables the nations to continue their reliance on traditional coal-fired power plants with minimal retrofits to burn wood pellets instead. But much of the actual deforestation and biomass production happens outside of the UK and Europe, with a large share located in the US South, which is also known as the nation's wood basket. The caveat, according to the biomass industry, is that only waste wood, in other words, wood that would not otherwise be used for timber or other industries, would be harvested for biomass. But as I argue, this very definition of waste wood means that many more forests will have been leveled than would have been otherwise to benefit this industry. You can see here the cycle of biomass energy, where forests, which are critical for carbon storage, are leveled and the wood is transported to the biomass factory, where it is pulverized into wood pellets. The pellets are then transported to a port where they're shipped off to the UK and Europe. Each one of these processes, from deforestation to manufacturing to shipping, releases carbon into the atmosphere. And that's just even before, right, they're actually burned in the coal-fired power plants. But it's not just carbon that's released. What the UK and the EU ignore, and even climate scientists opposed to the biomass industry have rarely recognized, is the immense dangers that the wood pellet manufacturing impose on neighboring communities. All across the South, in nearly every state, a biomass factory is located adjacent to Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities and results in the loss of forest land, some of which is owned by Black landowners. In 2020, I traveled to Northampton County to report on the environmental justice impacts of wood pellet manufacturing on local communities. This community, like many communities in Eastern North Carolina, suffered from economic stagnation in the wake of the consolidation of agriculture into large agri-corporations, the decline of the pulp and paper industry, and the movement of manufacturing jobs overseas. In the early 2010s, when Enviva hosted community meetings claiming that the industry would supply hundreds of quote unquote green jobs, many were eager to welcome the plant. Belinda Joyner, the Northeast organizer for the nonprofit Clean Water for North Carolina, had already seen Enviva's impacts on a neighboring community and tried to organize the community to stop the plant. But the company's promises were too enticing, and the county government rolled out a welcome mat for Enviva, promising an array of tax incentives. But shortly after the operations began, the community complaints were myriad. Here are just a few of the complaints from my interviews in Northampton County, and all of these people who I interviewed have lived in the county for generations and are also Black people. The noise, banging during all hours of the night, says Silverline Alston. The plant operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's not just the noise of the grinding of the trees into the pellets, it's also the truck traffic, right? From where they're felling trees nearby to the transport to the actual wood pellet facility. Belinda Joyner says, we have a gentleman that lives in the area. He said he has to wash his car every 3 days and power wash his house every 3 months. And that's the stuff that comes from Enviva. There's a young man that lives out there that says he doesn't cook out anymore because he can still see the residue falling from the sky. And it's really important, this notion of not being able to cook out anymore, because in Eastern North Carolina is where we have a sort of disproportionate number of Black home places, as I'll talk about later in this talk. And so these places, which have been in Black families for generations, are frequently the sites for family reunions and other forms of events which feature prominently cookouts. And so this sort of inability to cook out and to participate in this tradition really undermines, right, these sort of generations long practices of homecoming to the home place for Black communities in North Carolina. And finally, a quote from Richie Harding. There's been a high increase in the amount of animals, bobcats, black bears, coyotes, sightings more frequent in the Gaston area. And what Mr. Harding is talking about, he actually doesn't live directly adjacent to the Enviva plant. He lives closer to the forest land area that they're cutting down for the wood pellet facility. And so what he's saying is that these habitats, right, are being displaced, and that means that there are more frequent sightings and encounters with the wildlife who are displaced from those forests. The health effects have been even more devastating. Several reports from the Rachel Carson Council to the Environmental Integrity Project report dangerous levels of air pollution at these plants, including particulate matter, which is especially dangerous for respiratory health. Many plants also violated pollution limits set under the US Clean Air Act. While Enviva claimed in an interview that I gave with them that they had upgraded their plants to better contain air pollutants, Belinda Joyner made clear to me that several neighbors began suffering from moderate to severe respiratory challenges only after the plant began operations. Hold on. Okay. The climate impacts are similarly damning. Here are just some claims by the industry and the other biomass advocates that have been challenged over the past decade. The first claim is that biomass is quote unquote renewable energy because forests can be replanted. But as I discussed at the beginning of this talk, plantations are not forests. Forests serve many other purposes and sustain life in many more ways than through carbon storage and energy production. The second claim by the UK and the European Union is that carbon neutrality is achievable by substituting coal with biomass. But the EU's own land use policy and climate policy effectively creates a loophole wherein imported biomass is not included in the EU's carbon emissions accounting. This loophole effectively shifts the burden of emissions accounting from the UK and the EU to the biomass producing nations, such as the US. And of course, the US did not count these emissions from biomass production or distribution during its withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement under Trump. And arguably, it hasn't been counting for a really long time, not just during the Trump administration. The third claim is that biomass emits less carbon than coal. That claim, which has taken some time to be tested by climate scientists, has now been challenged by several studies which suggest that because burning wood pellets is less efficient in energy production than coal, using wood biomass to produce energy effectively emits more carbon than coal. Finally, there are claims that the wood pellet industry creates green jobs. But of course, as I just recounted, it's important for us to pay attention to the environmental justice impacts of the manufacturing plants on neighboring communities. And there's still a lot more research needed on those environmental health impacts for residents and for workers as well. As the biomass industry has grown in the US, it has followed the well-trodden path of other extractive industries dating back to the cotton trade, beginning in the Upper South and migrating gradually down to regions like the Alabama Black Belt or Cotton Belt, which is pictured here, and which, as noted earlier, is already dominated by the timber industry. Catherine Egeland, who is the chair of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Committee in neighboring Gulfport, Mississippi, had this to say, linking the histories. If you look at the map of the wood pellet trade states and the former cotton trade states, they are the same. The UK ignored the human rights abuses of the cotton trade with slavery. Now they are imperiling the descendants of that same population with the wood pellets. The US South also happens to be the most climate vulnerable region in the nation. But as I dug a little bit deeper into the histories of extractive forest industries, many of which, as I mentioned, displaced Black forest landowners, I recognized that there is a much larger and critical history of Black forest relations that have important implications for how we can think about Black life, Black epistemic traditions, and the future of forests. This painting, was not able to identify the artist, but it is a painting of a Hush Harbor in the antebellum era. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that is here in just a bit. The fates of forests and Black people in the US South are deeply intertwined. The plantation economies of the 19th century in Alabama and much of the Deep South cleared much of the region's native pine forests to produce monocultures linked to the murder and expulsion of indigenous peoples and the institution of slavery, like cotton, sugar, tobacco, rice, turpentine, tar, and pitch, among other commodities. Such extractive cultivation practices both brutalized and killed enslaved Black peoples and depleted Southern landscapes through severe soil erosion and eliminating critical habitats for thousands of species. In the Alabama Black Belt, native forest clearing coincided with the military defeat and expulsion of the Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw nations during the Creek War of 1813 to 1814. These indigenous nations had centuries-long relations to the forest landscape and were forced off the land as part of the US colonial expansion of the cotton trade, fueled mostly by textiles demand in Britain and Europe. Quote unquote, Alabama fever, which was the rush of planters from the Carolinas and Georgia to colonize new lands for cotton production further south, led to the forced migration of enslaved peoples to the much larger cotton plantations in Alabama, which was officially admitted to the United States just in 1819. The Black Belt region, so-called first because of its fertile Black prairie soil, and second because of its high concentration of Black residents, became the epicenter of slavery in Alabama. Over half of the state's enslaved population resided within the region's 10 counties. Despite their forced extraction of the deforested landscapes, Black people practiced relations to what remained of the forests that were substantially different and more reciprocal in nature. Just as their predecessors and contemporaries in the coastal Carolinas and Georgia survived and escaped slavery by making their lives in the low-lying swamplands or impassable highlands, Black peoples in the Black Belt relied on forests for a range of activities and resources that were integral to their physical, spiritual, and cultural survival. Numerous scholars have detailed myriad ways that enslaved Black people relied on forest landscapes for their survival. Mart A. Stewart details this complex relationship, beginning with the creation of the plantation landscape, which was, quote, lifted from the forests and swamps literally on the backs of slaves, end quote, who were forced to clear millions of acres of native Alabama forests to cultivate cotton plantations. But despite those beginnings, Stewart asserts that enslaved Black peoples lived, quote, closer to the ground and often understood Southern crops and Southern environments better than their masters, end quote. While planters attempted to prohibit Black peoples from engaging with the forest landscapes off the plantation, these landscapes were the sites of various Black traditions, from planting small gardens to hunting and fishing to practicing religion, as you can see with the Hush Harbor here. The foundations of what are now African-American foodways were cultivated through these deep and intimate relations of Black people to the forest landscape, from growing foods such as sweet potatoes, okra, and rice, to hunting deer, rabbit, and opossum. Songs and folk tales emerged from these knowledges as well, such as adaptations of the traditional West African tale of Brer Rabbit to reflect the social relations of plantation life. Wild foods foraged in the forest by Black and Indigenous peoples also became part of the spiritual and medicinal traditions that had a major influence on US medicine. Beyond the Black Belt, these extensive geographic knowledges of forest ecosystems also made escapes from slavery, temporary or permanent, more readily possible despite the vast reach of the plantation economy. Many enslaved peoples engaged in what's called petit marinage, where the forest provided cover, shelter, and food for a respite from the plantation, as well as an opportunity to reconnect with kin and other relations. Burials and religious rituals played out under the cover of trees, and such strong attachment to specific lands and threats of rebellion led some slaveholders to cede ownership of small portions of this land to enslaved peoples, who often maintained residence there and relation to those lands to pass along to their descendants, generations of whom maintained residence after the Civil War. Such intimate and mutualistic ecological and social relations practiced as part of slavery survival meant that Black communities possessed a different orientation to place creation than the extractive legalistic relations practiced by the dominant planter regime. Historian J.T. Rohn describes the Black Commons existing along the Anacostia River near Washington, D.C., among Black peoples who escaped from slavery, which included the Black Commons included communal cultivation of food, sharing of water resources, and creating a sense of home that was predicated on reciprocity. Despite the daily violence of the plantation and depending on the specific era and geography of slavery, many enslaved peoples maintained quarters that operated from different logics. There were communal gardens, forced rituals, and caretaking practices that countered the rote exploitation of their bodies and personhood experienced during the workday. These land relations across centuries and generations were a combination of cultural retentions from African origins and the necessary and desired practices developed during chattel slavery and beyond it. The fungible conceptualizations of property, hearkening back to the European Enlightenment age and the market systems that support it, neither contemplated Black land ownership. In other words, Black people were legal property and thus could not be understood to own anything, nor adjusted in the post-bellum era to accommodate the traditions within which Black people have historically related to land. Thus, the ways that Black people have practiced property ownership in the US has evolved over generations into the legal, quote unquote, problem of heir property. Land, which is land that is held in common by all the heirs of a decedent owner, that not only creates one of several documented ways that Black people lose land, but also engenders a dissonant relationship between Black people and property that persists as an ordinary part of Black life. And so here I have, in keeping with JT, the theme of the Black Commons, a photo of Fannie Lou Hamer, who in the 1970s started the Freedom Farm Cooperative in Mississippi. And that farm cooperative was created as a means for Black folks to collectively own land, and these particularly folks who had been either dispossessed from land or never had come into possession of land post-Civil War. And it acted as a counter, right, to the plantation, the ongoing, right, plantation power and economy in that region. So this was a land cooperative that grew food for subsistence, but also for market, essentially for the kind of collective well-being of the folks who were involved as members in the collective. And so J.T. Rohn suggests that practices like Fannie Lou Hamer's, deep into the 20th century, like the practices that he talks about during slavery on the Anacostia River, that are as Black ecologies emerging from the Black Commons, that suggest the power of reciprocal social relations between people as a praxis capable of not just sustaining human relations, but also the biosphere itself. Okay. The aftermath of slavery created the first opportunity for most newly freed Black peoples across the Western Hemisphere to establish places where they had control over their time, their labor, and their futures. Having been severed from generations of family spread across slaveholding and quote unquote free geographies, the family became a central focus of land relations. The purpose of owning land was not just to profit from its sale, but to maintain a place of safety, security, and preservation of legacy for generations. And critically, Black women have been central to shaping these quote unquote home places as a means of rebuilding the privacy and dignity of family life that was stripped during slavery. And as Bell Hooks describes in her essay on Homeplace, we Black people could not learn to love or respect ourselves in the culture of white supremacy on the outside. It was there on the inside, in that home place, most often created and kept by Black women, that we had the opportunity to grow and develop, to nurture our spirits. This task of making a home place, of making home a community of resistance, has been shared by Black women globally, especially Black women in white supremacist societies. To be certain, Even when Black people purchased land with aspirations for its fungibility and profit, social science research has long demonstrated that such land does not appreciate in the same way that white-owned land does. And in fact, it often experiences some form of depreciation. The research also shows that it is often difficult for Black landowners to exploit the natural resources of their land for profit, and that such Black-owned land is also more vulnerable to takings from government and through private theft than white-owned land. So it cannot thus be determined that a shift from these long-held ethics of Black land relationships to more capitalist land relations will provide vastly improved outcomes for Black landowners. Nevertheless, these historic Black land traditions present a set of challenges and opportunities that are important for considering the ecological, economic, and social futures for the rural South and the larger United States. Black forest landowners, properly contextualized within their relational histories to forests, are demonstrative of both these challenges and opportunities. In the midst of frictions between the economic pressures of racial capitalism, which encourage extractive relations to land, and which also have disparate negative impacts on Black livelihoods and habitability, as we've seen just now with the biomass industry. And this friction with the ecological interests arising from historic and contemporary quests for Black liberation via land relations. I argue that Black forest landowners in and outside the Black Belt, their histories and present-day practices offer alternative modes of forest relations that have important implications for the future of Southern forests, particularly as related to the timber industry and the ever-urgent challenges of climate change. Okay. Based on several studies of Black forest landowners across the US South and the larger nation, and the relatively low rates of Black participants in the commercial timber industry, one might surmise that a significant portion of Black-owned forest land is naturally recurring, perhaps untouched over several generations, or as regrowth from abandoned farmland. And this is according to a few studies on the timber industry in the US South and in Alabama in particular. The most common histories of Black forest relations reflected in these studies are about interdependence, relying on the forest for food, water, medicine, shade, shelter, moderate timber harvests, and allowing the forest ecosystem to continue unimpeded by over-extraction or destruction of habitat so that it would provide the same sustenance to future generations. And to be clear, I'm not arguing that Black forest landowners are somehow automatically protectors or saviors of the forest. But what I am arguing is that this historical context of Black forest relations and Black land practices, along with the structural barriers to participation in the timber industry, mean that many Black forest landowners tend to have different approaches to forest land than those practiced by the majority of forest landowners. Though the aims of current scholarship on Black forest land management in the US South are ostensibly interested in identifying ways to rectify racial inequity in the timber industry by addressing the related inequities of Black land tenure through adjusting air property laws and to achieve higher rates of Black enrollment in forest management programs. The underlying premise of that research is that the desirable outcome is for Black landowners to acclaim clear title to their land and to participate as equals in the timber industry. In other words, the ultimate outcome is for Black people's land relationships to resemble more closely that of their white counterparts. Aside from the challenges of gaining Black participation in quote unquote sustainable forest management, there is little critique of the timber industry at large, much less any discussion of what might be desirable about current and historic models of Black forest relations. The model of sustainable forest management is presented as one that Black landowners automatically do not fit, despite having what Connor Bailey and others estimate to be over 1 million acres of intact forest land across 13 states of the US South. Such presumptions not only negate generations of wisdom and practice among Black forest landowners, assuming them to be simply, quote, victims of racial inequity rather than active strategists and architects of their land and their futures, but they also negate both history and contemporary facts on the ground. And I want to just, highlight a couple of things here, aside from what I have written here on these slides. This kind of long history of land ownership that dates back to the postbellum era or before, and sometimes even from maroon communities, is reflective, right, of those longstanding relationships, right, and vested interest across generations of maintaining and sustaining the forest as a forest, and not simply as a resource for commodification of timber. Although timber harvests absolutely do happen, right, in these spaces too, it's just in a different way. And those lower rates of participation in the commercial industry, as evidenced by many studies, right, dating back to, I think for this paper, I looked at studies dating back to 1985, and over Black forest land owners who may want to enter, right, on more equal terms in the commercial timber industry, cite various forms of like legal, procedural, and other forms of discrimination, essentially, that bar their participation or make it a lot more expensive, essentially, to enter into the industry. And often the minimal kind of land acreage that you need to be a big operator in this sort of commercial timber industry is more than many Black forest land owners still have in their possession. And this is also related, right, to the air property loss to land loss due to the antagonism, I would say, of the law towards air property. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you want to know more about that. So they're more likely to possess common family property or air property, which is resonant with the ethics of what Bell Hooks calls the homeplace, what J.T. Roan calls the Black Commons, and they typically have a more diversified economic use of forest land. They issue sort of limited permits and stuff for hunting and fishing on their land, other forms of recreation, including, right, and also, right, some moderate participation in the timber industry. The Black land practices and dispositions outlined above can be understood as strategies for what Catherine McKittrick calls Black livingness within the US system of racial capitalism and the continuation of plantation power, manifested most prominently in this case by the timber industry. There are also practices that belong to a deep lineage of Black ecological strategies designed through principles of reciprocity, non-impingement, and continuity. The Black Commons, described by Roan as reciprocal social relations between Black people, which have the power, as I've said before, to sustain human relations in the biosphere, often occurred within what Celeste Winston calls, quote, maroon geographies, end quote, places that advance alternative ways of understanding and producing space against and outside of these structures of racial violence rooted in history and legacies of slavery, end quote. The home place frequently represents all three of these Black ecological strategies: the maroon geography dating back to the antebellum era that required alternative relations to land to create collective safety, the Black commons, wherein land and its cultivation were a shared social enterprise to maintain interdependence, safety, and longevity, and the interdependent forest relations to maintain essential sustenance and protection for multiple generations. Within this matrix of Black ecological practices, the contemporary timber industry might be interpreted as more as a threat to the integrity of the home place than as an opportunity for its future viability. The replication of the plantation regime, operated via remote control, possesses a parallel ecological threat to the home place, the region, and ultimately the planet because of its compounded social, economic, and atmospheric impacts that increase vulnerability to storms, to poverty, to illness, to exploitative labor relations, to species loss, to premature death. For Black forest land owners, most of whom still either live on their land or have deep social and familial connections to those who live in impacted regions, the choice between higher profitability and sustaining traditional forest relations, particularly in the most timber-dependent regions, remains a critical tension that would be difficult to reconcile without structural change to dominant land relations. But what remains evident is that Black forest relations, as they are known and documented, possess a strategy of abundance and life that have preserved the integrity of forest landscapes for multiple generations, and with important consequences for the sustainability of family land tenure and for the overall health of the forest ecosystem, which is essential for protections against climate change. Future scholarship on Black forest land owners and forestry more generally would benefit not only from attending to the structural, economic, and political dynamics shaping livability and opportunities in timber-dependent communities, but also attend to the possibilities created by forest relations that are far less profit-driven and managerial and more in alignment with sustaining the life of the landscapes and the people who live there. Thank you. I'll stop there and take any questions you have.
Danielle, can you hear me?
Yes, you're a little in and out, but I can mostly hear you.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there are any ethnographic studies of these Black land owners, and whether I'm very interested in whether they actually of what's referred to as subsistence production, right? Whether they constitute household economies within this sphere that actually relies on whatever is produced within these spaces or produced or utilized within these spaces. Why I ask that is because your account of how Black landowners make use or the history of Black use of this land, ecological use of this land, reminds me of other spaces in the Americas, right? Mm-hmm. And certainly your invocation of this notion of heirs, land, customary land tenure, non-freehold tenure. I was wondering whether these Black land owners in this area actually involved in the market in other ways.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so from what I could understand of your question is you asked if there were any ethnographic studies on these Black forest land owners that we could look at, and then also about these particular more sort of direct like sustenance relations directly from the forests. Are you talking about more like subsistence, like how?
Whatever they're involved in with the forest. So they're living off the whatever, whether they are gardens or whether they are hunting or fishing or whatever. I'm trying to think the household, how does the household exist within this the larger context of the market economy to make, to support the argument that there is an alternative approach to land ownership in these areas.
Yeah. So yes, there are quasi-ethnographic. There are a number of studies. I would point you in the direction of Connor Bailey, who's now an emeritus professor from Auburn University. And And he's a rural sociologist, and he has been interested in air property, particularly in Alabama, for a long time, and has done several studies, right, about connecting the timber industry to the sort of extractive land relations that disproportionately, right, impact Black landowners. But he also did a, I want to say, I can't remember, it was probably even as long ago as 2008, a kind of ethnographic study of Black air property owners, many of which, right, like also owned forest land, right? There are all sorts of landowners. And yeah, about like their, the desirability of maintaining air property, what it actually meant to them, right, in their land relation. And I think some of it is quoted in the article that I gave you for today. But yeah, there was a really strong sense, right, of like, a necessity of keeping land in the family and not wanting to use it to sell, right? But that doesn't mean you can't make money off the land, but you have to make money off the land in a way that is sustainable across generations. And that was really reflected, right, in some of Bailey's studies. And I think in a couple of these other studies of Black forest landholders. Unfortunately, a lot of the scholarship is, you can tell that the researchers go into the studies with the aim of trying to figure out how we can, convert that kind of land relation into something that looks more like a commodification, right? Without actually understanding that there's something valuable about, right, that those relations. I can tell you from my perspective as a lawyer, and just in conversations, I haven't practiced, trust and estates law that deals with like wills and those sort of things, but like, anecdotally, if you talk to the folks at the Land Loss Prevention Project in Durham, right, they're the people who work, the law firm that works most prominently with mostly Black air property owners. And they'll tell you that it is frequent that they have clients that come to them with the intention of writing a will that creates effectively air property, right? Because they're wanting to continue this relation to the land and to not sell it. The aim is not to lose the land. But there's a vulnerability there because if you can't, the heirs can be numerous. You can be in a position right after several generations where you don't know who all the heirs are, or all the heirs don't know each other. And that is what legally leaves these lands open to capture by the state, because any one person can sell off their interest, and whoever they sell their interest to can force the sale of the entire land, right? There are all sorts of legal mobilizations to try to stop that from happening, but it definitely happens. Last thing I'll say is that in terms of subsistence living, I mean, I can tell you, I did several oral histories in the Alabama Black Belt in 2016. And one of the things that was so remarkable that I was not expecting, I was actually there to think about infrastructure provision and these sort of things, which is also one of the challenges of the timber industry, is that they prohibit, right? They interfere with other forms of development happening for people who live there because they're not living there. But a lot of the people that I interviewed were engaged in some form of subsistence farming. And yeah, it was just a really important kind of finding for me. I hadn't expected it, but they're like, we've been living on this land for generations, right? Like, this is how we sustain ourselves. And actually, this is how we're able to not necessarily have to like enter into the job economy all the time, because we've owned our land for generations, and we're able to practice, right? Harken back to these old practices. And the youngest person that I talked to at that time was like 36 years old, who was engaged in this practice. So I think it's very alive and well. It's just not as well documented, I think. Can you just give me 1 second? I need to plug my computer in before I lose you.
Danielle, while you're doing that, there's a few questions here in our Q&A.
Okay.
I'm going to read one of them so the folks in the room here can also hear the question. So this is from Olivia Polk. I wonder if you can talk more about how air property dynamics are at work in relationship to the contemporary timber industry. And are there ways that the gender dynamics of home place you've discussed in impacting present assertions of these Black ecological ethical relationships to forests in the locations you're keeping track of? Did your interview work yield insights around this? And you should be able to see those too.
Yeah, so thank you, Olivia, for that question. That's really great. So when I was doing this study on a review, a kind of literature review of the scholarship on Black forest landowners, one of the things that was cited over and over and over again as a barrier to Black forest landowners' entry into the kind of commoditized timber industry was the fact that they owned air property. Because without clear title to land, there are historically and still today, right, have been a lot of barriers towards doing the kinds of things with land, right, that treat your property as an asset, for instance. So for instance, to like take out a second mortgage, right, on land, to do or on a home on that land, right, or to kind of get a loan, right, to to convert, right, this forest land into some kind of commodity, right, requires clear title to land, right? So those are the kinds of legal structural barriers that are cited that are as a consequence of air property in these particular relations, which is why it's sort of seen as this problem, right, that needs to be overcome in order for Black landowners to achieve quote unquote equity, right, in the timber industry. And this is despite, right, like, generations of structural discrimination, right, explicit and, right, implied against Black forest landowners or any Black landowner by agencies like, right, the USDA, right, which is heavily involved in, adjudicating, providing resources for, right, forest landowners and for the timber industry, because it's part of agriculture. So yeah, that's one of the dynamics, right? So that those tensions for these communities, for these landowners, is like, if I would need to break with this particular kind of tradition in order to enter this industry that already has this history of antagonism against me. I'm not sure that I will even benefit in the same ways, right, from going the commodities route, right? And I also know that I'm structurally disadvantaged maintaining, right, this particular land relation because of how the economy operates. So that's one of the, I would say, the big challenge. The gender dynamics of the home place. I haven't looked that this. I would consider myself at the very beginning, right, of this exploration into forest land ownership. What I can tell you is that the home place as a thing, right, as a phenomenon, is very alive and well. And I haven't seen its like any sort of explicit study of it in relationship to the forest, other than some, it's like breadcrumbs that are dropped in some of these interviews and some of these studies with Black forest landowners, right? Like, that you've got an air property, and you'll hear like a respondent who is a female landowner who has been in the land for a really long time. And the way that she is talking about it, right, is like reminiscent, right, of what Bell Hooks is talking about in the Homeplace. So it's like, it's putting those things together, because it's not necessarily the use of all of the language, right? But it's, it's there in bits and pieces, and I have a lot more studying to do about it.
Thank you. The next question is from an anonymous attendee. Does the doctrine of discovery impact Black land ownership similarly to Indigenous land ownership in the United States, specifically in relation to air property?
Oh, that's a really great question. That's so interesting. It's not quite, the same thing, although well, I guess in a sense, like, they're certainly related. I'll say that, right? There is when you go to a register of deeds, right, to look at documentation on a property, there are certain indications in those records that can identify it as air property. There's certain language, right, like those sort of things. And to the extent that industries are looking for or, big land conglomerates, or just, large landholders, right, are looking for new property. This is a way, right, looking through those records and trying to find which land parcels are vulnerable in those sort of ways, is kind of a way to essentially like target and extort, right, and prey on those landscapes. So it's not necessarily like, I think kind of the way you might think of it is linked to the discovery doctrine is like, well, here we are here at the Register of Deeds being explorers and like looking for land that we could possibly grab and possibly take. And upon discovery, essentially, right, of this air property, like we will then put the things in motion essentially to try to take that land, right? So we do know, right, that and especially from my experience in Eastern North Carolina, right, that there have been a lot of systematic land grabs, right, of Black family lands by big agricultural conglomerates. And a lot of, I'm sure how that happens, right, is through looking at those kinds of records, right, and then targeting, right, those lands to kind of consolidate them. So yeah, that's a great question. And that's probably the best I can do at this point, but that's a really great thing to kind of look into more.
Okay, and this is from Trivius Caldwell. I appreciate the idea that the forest landscape can be considered a site of agricultural racial uplift. An example might be the efforts George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington, the examples of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee, nestled in the Black Belt. My interest has to do with Black folks in the South and their deep connection with the land. Would you talk more about your claim that the fate of the forest and Black people are intertwined? You made brief mention of folk and other vernacular traditions.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is goes understated, I guess, because it feels like such ancient history to us. I mean, at this point, right, is to like understand that the forest was this alternative, like a literal, like this sort of boundary, right? If you're thinking about plantation life, it served as a boundary between slavery and freedom, in a sense, right? So the accounts that you might read of things like the brush harbors, right? places where people gathered to practice religious traditions that were denied to them, right, on the plantation, ways that people learn language, right, by meeting up with each other in these forest landscapes, was essential, right, to the survival of enslaved Black folks, right? And this is not to mention, right, just the practices of marriage that began that are as old as slavery, right? As long as there had been slavery, there has been marriage, and marriage had to occur in these sort of clandestine, hard to reach, right, impenetrable types of landscapes, typically swamps or dense forests, right, where there wasn't the kind of cultivation, right? There wasn't even necessarily the property ownership yet, right, in some of these spaces. And so I think about those histories, and I think about how the forests were the spaces of escape, right? The forests were the spaces of learning. They were spaces for religious rites, for burials. And they were also spaces where Black folks learned about medicines, right? Learned about the landscape there, how to heal themselves, right? What they could eat, all of those sort of things. And so without forests, like really like as a literal matter, right? Like, untold, right? Like thousands of enslaved Black peoples could not have survived. And then, right, in the aftermath of slavery, right, you have people who are become landowners, particularly in the Alabama Black Belt, right, was actually a huge concentration of Black land ownership in the aftermath of slavery. A lot of those plantations get, destroyed, or they move further out to the coastal areas. And then there's this sort of secondary growth of forests that on those same plantations, and then also the forests that had existed during slavery. So I think, and those relationships continued, right? Like, just because the economy has shifted, right, in various ways that have made those relationships not as legible to us, right, and not as obvious. I do think that those there are, for a lot of folks who live in those areas, those relationships are still there, even though they're not as direct and as urgent, right, in the same kinds of ways.
Thank you. If anyone has a question here, just let me know. We can just speak up. I'll ask the next one in the chat though. Just from Dirk Phillips said, it seems to me that you're making two related arguments. One, that the wood pellet industry is an environmental nightmare, and two, that it further perpetuates pre-existing deeply structural forms of racism. I would be curious to hear from you if you were to think about a path forward that is focused on both well-being of people and well-being of land nature. What path would you advocate, given the exploitative forms of land forest ownership often lead to environmental degradation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I am making both of those arguments for certain. And I think like literally in my attempt to actually kind of answer the question, or to think through the question that you're asking about a path forward, what I ran into, right, is this history, right? And in the literature on Black forest land ownership, this ambivalence, right, of the landowners themselves towards this industry, right? And it's not, and I want to be clear, right, that it's not that these folks are just like, total anti-capitalists, right? It's not that, right? Like what has happened, right, is that they've endured, right, like generations of systematic, right, being closed off from these extractive forms of industry. And in the midst, right, have had, and also have these histories of these land relations. And so there's this tension here, right? It's like, I cannot become wealthy by operating land in this way, right? In terms of these historic forest land relations. The economy as it stands with the timber industry actually doesn't allow for it. Maybe if we, practice more of these more kind of regenerative, right, economic practices with regard to forests, then it could be something that could be sustainable over time. But as it is, right, the forest land in the US South is dominated by this industry. So I think my approach is like actually thinking about, hey, like these histories are important. It's not just history, right? Like these present day, right, relationships are important, and they're caught, right, in this space kind of where they, it's hard to move forward with commodification in the same way. And, but it's also hard to stay where they are because it's kind of like having, they're being encroached upon, right, by this larger industry. So, I think about that, right? Like I think about, okay, what are those practices that are happening right now, right, for these folks who have been locked out of this industry for so long? And like, what can we learn from them, right? And how can we think about that as the part of the way forward, as opposed to trying to assimilate them into, right, this sort of commodities exchange. So yeah, that's sort of where I landed. Like, this is kind of how I got to that point.
Okay, Danielle, I want to be a little conscious of time because I know you have to run to another class soon. Thank you for being with us. The next two questions, I'm going to read them out. They have related components, so maybe you could speak to an element of them, and that'll probably be all we have time for with you. Okay. Regarding the biomass industry, are there other counties in North Carolina where these impacts are being endured by primarily Black neighbors? Are companies exploiting Black-owned land for the raw inputs for pellet production, or are Black landowners enduring the environmental justice issues and receiving none of the benefit of the industry's presence? Are any of the county commissions beginning to push back? And then this related question, wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the historical geographical shifts within the timber industry and how the plantation logic impacts the move of the industry from the US North to the South. Is it just about more forest land availability after exhausting resources in the North, or is there more at play?
Yeah, those are two great questions. The answer to Sarah, yeah, there are a lot of counties in North Carolina that are impacted, and I'm trying to think right now. The very first one in North Carolina was in Ahoskie, which is in Hertford County. I think it's very close to Northampton County. A lot of these industries, and I think this connects to the last question. From what I understand, right, like as I mentioned before, the US South in general, like how we understand the South geographically, is called like the nation's wood basket. It has been true for a long time, right? Because the timber industry, there's a lot of forest, right? There's a lot of forest cover in the South. And the timber industry, the paper and pulp industry, right, have been prominent, right, in the South for decades, for right generations. So the US South was a place that was ripe, right, for the biomass industry to locate itself. And so this question about, and I think, you can look at, there's a map of biomass industries in the South that the Dogwood Alliance, who's a sort of advocate about biomass impacts, they have it on their website, and you can look at where all the the wood pellet plants are. So this question of Black companies exploiting Black-owned land for the raw inputs, I think it's a little bit of both and, right? So I think there are some Black forest land owners who, get a deal to sell their land essentially to a company like Enviva for the purpose of essentially deforesting, right? Like that land for the wood pellets. But then, of course, the idea, right, is to convert those forest lands into tree plantations, right? Because it's supposed to be renewable, right? So you're supposed to use the land over and over again. So it may end up being a kind of contract sometimes with those landowners. If they're not selling the land, they may end up becoming kind of like in vivo becomes like a lessee of the land, essentially, to like regenerate those forests or regenerate those plantations. So, I mean, sure, right? There are some Black forest landowners who could benefit in some of those cases. Oftentimes, forest lands that become plantations are massive plots, right? And especially if you're trying to work with a company that's producing energy for countries, right? So, you know, and typically the people who have at this point, right, that much forest land are some kind of company, right? Other kind of company or big, forest land holder. And they're typically not Black, but I'm sure that there are some, right, Black-owned forest landowners who benefit in that particular way. But very few, I think, relatively, right? So the county commissions, I have not seen a lot of pushback yet from the government side. It's mostly communities that push back. And there are a number of reasons why. I mean, a lot of, as we kind of, I think, understand, right, like governments get all sorts of, or government officials, build all sorts of relationships with these sort of big ag companies, particularly in places like North Carolina. It happens throughout the South. And so there's more than a kind of vested interest in having some of those industries come in, even if they're causing a lot of problems. Historical and geographical shifts within the timber industry. Oh, and the move of the industry. So the industry is not moving from like the US North to the South. It started in the South and it moved further south. And I can't quite account for why that trend happened in the way that's similar to how the cotton trade ended up happening in terms of mobilization down from the up south to the lower south. But I can't quite account for, I don't have an accounting for like exactly how that happened. But yeah, some of the first ones, what I know is like some of the first ones were in North Carolina, were in like Tennessee, parts of South Carolina. And then like you're like maybe 5 years ago, we started seeing a lot more start to proliferate in the deeper South. But it doesn't mean that it's a total move. Like all of those plants are operating. But it is true that in Alabama in particular, like, these companies keep building factories with more and more capacity, right? So the industries are getting, the plants are getting bigger, right? As they are evolving.
Okay. Thank you. I think we should close here. And thank everyone for joining us on Zoom, and thank you, Professor Danielle Purifoy, for joining us with this really generous presentation on an already busy day. Hope to see you again soon. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Take care.